Welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Seminary's series on church history. It is arguable that the four most significant names at the heart of the Protestant Reformation were Martin Luther in Germany, Ulrich Zwingli and Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, and John Calvin in Geneva. Over the next few podcasts, we will be looking in a little detail at the life and significance of John Calvin. I remember as a very young Christian coming across two very brief biographies of John Calvin that actually captivated me. One was called The Man God Mastered by Jean Cadier, and the other was by a German Emanuel Stickelberger. I was so captivated by what I was reading about Calvin that in my dissertation, in my first degree in economic history, while my fellow students were writing theses on transatlantic trade and the origins of banking, etc., I wrote my thesis on John Calvin and the struggle for Reformed Orthodoxy in Geneva. I'm still never quite sure how my professor managed to mark the thesis, but he knew that in God's purpose I was going to Edinburgh University thereafter to study theology, and he was remarkably indulgent to me. John Calvin was born in the year 1509 in the township of Noyon, about 60 or so miles northeast of Paris in the region of Picardy, and he died in 1564. Calvin's father, Gerard, was a reasonably successful lawyer who had good connections with the local gentry and with the cathedral clergy. And because of those connections, Jean Cauvin, as the French would have it, was educated privately along with the sons of the aristocratic de Montfort family. And he was also given one or two chaplaincies in the cathedral, which would provide for his university education. Calvin's father planned a career in the church for his son, and that path led through the studies at the University of Paris. He would take the arts course and then go on to 9 years of study for the theological doctorate. After that, he would trust the de Montfort's patronage and his own talents to reach the higher levels of preferment. Calvin was an excellent scholar, a very good Latinist, and proficient in the study of theology. But suddenly all the plans that Calvin's father had for his son fell through. Through a dispute with the local bishop, we're not too sure exactly what the dispute was about, Gerard changed his mind and decided that his son should achieve greatness in the law and not the church. John was a dutiful son, and so for the next 5 or so years he studied at the University of Orléans, attaining some distinction in a study for which he really didn't have any great love. During these years, in the late 1520s, he was brought into contact with the ideals of the Renaissance and probably, although we're not certain, with the evangelical faith. During this time, Greek was steadily making its way as a necessity and not merely as an ornament to a scholar's equipment. Erasmus's Greek New Testament had been printed in 1516, and in academic circles it was all the rage. And many were turning to the study of Hebrew as well. There was not only a revival of classical learning, there was a revival of the ancient languages. And allied to what Heinrich Bullinger called the divine art of printing, from the printing press, first in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg, life was transforming at an incredible pace, not just for John Calvin, but for European society as a whole. Calvin began learning Greek and a little later Hebrew. He was an accomplished writer. A friend of mine, professor of French, told me that Calvin, along with Pascal, was one of the originators of modern French prose. Calvin read widely, Aristotle, Plato, all the ancients that he could lay his hands on. He set to work editing and commenting on a Latin treatise by Seneca, De Clementia, first published in 1532 when he was 22 years of age. But during the years of studying law and the languages, a profound change overtook Calvin. Calvin was coming increasingly into contact with Luther, not personally, but with his teachings. There were many Lutherans in Paris and Orleans. We actually don't know the time or the circumstances of Calvin's conversion to the evangelical faith. In only really 2 places in all of his many volumes, almost 60 volumes, does Calvin refer at all to his conversion, most significantly in the preface to his Latin commentary on the Psalms. And even there he is somewhat reticent and vague, because for Calvin, as with the Reformation as a whole, the great issue was not how did you come to faith, but that you did come to faith. Let me read to you what Calvin himself wrote. God drew me from obscure and lowly beginnings and conferred on me that most honourable office of herald and minister of the gospel. What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, he tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years. For I was strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy, that nothing less could draw me from such depths of mire. And so this mere taste of true godliness that I received set me on fire with such a desire to progress, that I pursued the rest of my studies more coolly, though I did not give up on them altogether. Before a year had slipped by, anybody who longed for a pure doctrine kept on coming to learn from me, still a beginner and a raw recruit. Calvin became marked out as a Lutheran, and when persecution arose in Paris, he was forced into hiding, travelling here, travelling there throughout different parts of France. At last he had to leave the country altogether, and he sought refuge in the city of Basel, providentially a printing centre. And it was in Basel that Calvin published the book by which his name will always be associated, his institutes, the Institutio de Christianissimi Religionis, the Institutes of the Christian Religion. The word institutes perhaps could be better translated principles of the Christian faith, or instruction in the Christian faith. Calvin was initially concerned to provide an evangelical manual for his fellow Frenchmen and Frenchwomen, whom he says were thirsting for the truth of God. The first part of the title expresses the same. The principles of the Christian faith, Calvin writes, containing almost the whole sum of godliness and whatever it is necessary to know about saving doctrine. Calvin later wrote that when he undertook the work, quote, all I had in mind was to hand on some elementary teaching by which anyone who had been touched by an interest in religion might be formed to true godliness. I laboured at the task especially for our own Frenchmen, for I saw that many were hungering and thirsting after Christ, and yet that only a very few had any real knowledge of him. The first 3 chapters in 1536 edition take up 81 pages. They form the heart of the book. Between the Roman Catholic Church and the Reformers, there were three major disagreements on the church, the sacraments, and justification. The last of these had been fully explained. The first was kept for the final chapter. 2 chapters were given to discussion of the sacraments of the Roman Church not recognised by the Reformers. And these 2 chapters, with 106 pages, are longer because the subject was so important. In the final chapter, Calvin packs into 3 topics: Christian liberty, the authority of the church, and political government. It's striking that right from the first edition of the Institutes, Calvin devotes so much space to the sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, the great initiatory rite of the gospel, and the continuing, nourishing provision of the visible signs and seals of the covenant of grace was so important to Calvin, perhaps something of a mystery to later generation of evangelicals. And in our next podcast on Calvin, we will see how his life progresses from this juncture on.